Welcome back to the Cyber Talent Matrix Live. We're so glad you are here. For those who are tuning in for the first time, this show is all about exploring the people side of cybersecurity, the roles, the skills, and the strategies organizations need to build a resilient workforce. I'm Jeff Welgan, joined by my co-host, Dr. Sasha Vanterpool, Will Denman. And today we're excited to welcome a special guest, Will Markow, CEO of FourOne Insights. Will is one of the leading experts on cyber labor market analytics and future skills, and he's here with us to unpack what's really happening in the labor market today and where it's headed tomorrow. So let's get into it. Welcome to the show, Will.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me, Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to just kind of jump right in. I know, let me actually jump in with a question for you personally. I'm going to ask you this instead of at the end of the show, if you'll come back and join us for another show, because there is no way we're going to get through all the things we need to get through in this hour, picking your brain. So if you wouldn't mind joining us in a future episode, we'd love that.
I can think of nothing I would rather do on a Tuesday afternoon. I would gladly join you.
Might have to be a Wednesday. A lot of times we do this on Wednesday.
Any day of the week, you pick.
Well, fantastic. Well, first off, I noticed on LinkedIn this morning you posted, shared some new research. Do you want to just kind of share that news with the rest of the folks who are listening in
Yeah.
on what they can expect from that research from you and the state of Massachusetts?
Yeah, I would love to. I, as you mentioned, just released some research with the Massachusetts Technology Leadership Council. So shout out to them as well, who partner with me on the research. And what we're really looking at is what are the emerging skills in the tech economy in Massachusetts. We looked at what were the fastest growing skills that were in demand among Massachusetts employers. We looked at things like what are the salary premiums associated with those skills and the supply and demand ratios, so that we could really pinpoint not only what are the skills that are increasingly important, but how hard is it for Massachusetts employers to actually find workers with those skills so that they can get some guidance on how to go about building their workforce around those emerging capabilities. And unsurprisingly, AI definitely jumped out at the top, but perhaps more surprisingly, the story is definitely not just about AI. I think that really dominates the headlines. There's a lot of hype and hyperbole about the impact of AI. And sure, it's growing rapidly in Massachusetts, just as it is across the country. But about 7 out of the top 10 skills that we identified as fastest growing in Massachusetts actually were not really related to AI, or they were tangentially related to AI. And we actually saw that there's very strong demand for a lot of traditional tech skills, whether it's related to security and privacy skills like GDPR and encryption. They're actually growing rapidly within Massachusetts. But we also saw a strong demand for various data skills, which is increasingly needed as we have to make sure our data sets are clean and ready for AI, as well as a number of other skills as well that I would say fall into more of a quote unquote traditional tech bucket as opposed to the new AI landscape that everybody's talking about as well. So it's really interesting research. I'm a little biased when I say that, but I encourage anybody to go out and check out the research. It has some interesting data points, some implications for employers and educators and others who are trying to build the tech workforce or the cyber workforce for that matter, both in Massachusetts as well as across the country.
Yeah, and I appreciate you putting that out because it is interesting, I think, as well, to see the data at a state level, focused in there. So and important. So to any other states who are listening who want to get some additional insight onto what's happening in their state and future skills, Will's, I think, ready to help you out if you are ready to roll up your sleeves with them. Also wanted to welcome Will Denman, Sasha. How are you guys doing today?
Good,
Doing
good.
well.
Happy to be here.
Oh yeah.
No, go ahead, Will.
Oh yeah, no. So I was what was it? Well, I was just gonna say as a little brief aside, because I was reading into it and I do really like the fact that, when it talks about all of the emerging skills, especially like AI and stuff, it's not just lumped into a huge category, right? There's like a lot of the tangential stuff around it, but like, okay, we're talking about large language modeling, we're talking about like, machine learning operations and stuff like that, which some people like, because obviously there's like, oh, we want people who are really into AI, but what subset of that are you into? Is it the generative stuff? Is it and so part of like that further breakdown, at least coming from a guy who works with a lot of that stuff, is very appreciative of. So I just kind of wanted to just a quick little shout out on that one too. So
No,
I
a blanket
appreciate it.
statement is often too broad for AI, so we need to break it down a little bit. So glad that you were able to do that in the report. So how does someone get their hands on that report? Will, where's the best place for them to download that aside from your LinkedIn profile?
Yeah, so There is a link to that in the both the LinkedIn post, but also on our website at FourOne Insights. If you go to our Insights tab, we have an article up about it. And then also you can go to the Massachusetts Technology Leadership Council's website. They also have a link to the report, and you can download it completely free and get your hands on it.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I wanted to have you on today's show specifically because during episode 2, I talked about, we all shared our this week I learned. Mine was kind of a setup for having you on the show because it was around the point I made was around college educated people essentially being the rising almost to the top of long-term unemployment status. And I was really, when I read that, and it's talking about the entire labor market, but I was really interested in getting your perspective on what does that mean for cyber profession and college educated people and as it relates to employment or job openings or long-term unemployment. So I didn't know if you had anything you could kind of weigh in on that as we kind of dive into some details for today's show.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting question. It's arguably one of the most important questions to think about across the workforce more broadly, not just in cyber, because I think that for a long time there was this implicit assumption that you go to college and you're going to come out the other end with not only a degree but more job opportunities, and that was especially the case if you were going into fields like cyber or other IT centric fields. And the past few years, we've really seen that implicit assumption starting to break down. And you're seeing data points now where a lot of college graduates, especially recent college graduates, have, as you mentioned, heightened unemployment rates. They're having a harder time finding jobs than they did in the past. And that's leading to a lot of anxiety for folks. And I think, cybersecurity, I would argue, was a little bit ahead of the curve on this one. Sometimes it's good to be ahead of the curve. Sometimes it's bad. This is a case where you probably didn't want to be ahead of the curve, because I think that for a long time, you've been hearing kind of these diametrically opposed comments in the cybersecurity ecosystem where employers are saying, we can't find the workers we need. And then recent grads were saying, we can't find jobs. So what's going on here? And I think that it really was the case for a long time that employers, they're struggling to find workers, and they were primarily looking for more experienced workers, and they weren't looking for more entry level workers. And you had this chicken and egg problem where on the supply side, you had all the people who were trying to build the cybersecurity workforce because employers said they couldn't find workers. And as a result, unfortunately, educators and individuals listened to everybody. And they said, okay, yeah, we're going to produce more graduates. But then employers, they didn't update their hiring practices to build intentional pipelines that brought entry-level workers into those more experienced roles. And you had a case where employers were poaching from a small, pool of workers, and you couldn't find entry-level folks. And I think that a lot of the trends that we're seeing now as it relates to a lack of entry-level opportunity in many ways reflect what we've seen in the cybersecurity ecosystem for a while. And that is we have more graduates and employers are less willing to look at entry-level candidates for a variety of reasons. A lot of people point to AI. I'm not sold that it's just because of AI. That might be a piece of it, but I think there are many, many other factors at play. And, we definitely see a fairly sobering, picture.
Will Denman, I think this is interesting because you have colleagues, you're not too far from graduation, right? So like, what
Oh,
is this
yeah.
like for your peers and peers who are maybe just a little bit younger than you?
Oh, it's like, well, so I will say, I can't really capture the whole sentiment of all of them, like just, in one statement. But for a lot of it, it's very demoralizing, right? I mean, obviously, like there's this whole thing of, hey, when you graduate college, like you get that like huge job, and then all of a sudden you're like living by yourself and you're like your own person and all this stuff. But at least right now, we're not really seeing that. But yeah, no, so it's been super, like demoralizing for a lot of people. They have to kind of branch into things that they wouldn't otherwise want to do, right? Um, so it's things like that. And I find cybersecurity is a very interesting thing to talk about because at least, I was for a long time I was thinking about like fully getting into like, oh, I want to be a threat analyst or like, go into reverse engineering and stuff like that, like all kinds of crazy stuff. But I remember it was something actually one of my family members was talking about because he's well embedded in the field. He was like, well, actually, a lot of people start out like working help desk or doing kind of those positions. And I will say that a lot of, college grads, they're immediately going to be like, oh, well, I have a degree in this and maybe like one internship experience of like maybe 6 months. And they're like, I'm ready for this next huge step. While, they may be like, yo, get behind a help desk, right? Or do something that's kind of a little bit more like, it's not as like pressing, I guess you could say, right? Everything's important, but it's not like you're, you know, this super huge like pillar of the company, right? Because in some ways you just haven't had the experience to really test that, right?
Yeah,
Test that
yeah.
kind of metal.
I think also from the other side of the coin, I remember just my experience kind of previously working related to higher education and a couple years ago now, but even just from the administrative mindset, how hard it is to even track where are these students coming from. I feel that like, a lot of people, to your point, will kind of for the past couple of years kind of got into cyber kind of an adjacent way or like doing more IT and more kind of computer science degrees or just different kind of degrees because there wasn't a cybersecurity degree that was available, at the associate or bachelor's or even master's or doctoral level like there is now. I feel like that's become definitely just kind of more available as far as having an actual degree in cyber versus before, years ago, it tended to be like other kind of avenues that you would eventually get into cyber or maybe
Yeah.
certifications or, things like that. So I definitely think it's just interesting how that has shifted as the field has shifted, as this talent gap has, as the needs have. But at the end of the day, even just tracking where are people coming from and what degree do they have has been a challenge because people just come from so many different avenues. But to your point, at the end of the day, no matter what degree you have, if you're choosing to pursue higher education, it doesn't have to be a degree. It could be a boot camp, a certification program, whatever education you're doing. For you not to be able to find a job, it's just disheartening, and it just is like, man, I put all this work and it's still such a challenge.
Oh,
Sorry. So you picked stuff up. So the power went out completely, and I was like, "What's going on?" It's a beautiful day, storms or anything. I look outside. Apparently, somebody crashed their car into the power line outside, and they're currently trying to fix it. So
Oh, wow.
oh my gosh. Well,
uh, there's a good reason.
I hope people are okay.
yeah.
We'll have to
Yeah.
take some pictures and share it with the show afterwards.
That's crazy.
I'm sorry to
Gosh.
hear that though, because that sounds like a longer fix than just a little blip
Yeah, for
restoration
everybody. That's
lineman out there to take care of. I hope everybody's okay. I don't mean to be
yeah,
laughing. It's
Yeah.
serious.
crazy.
Um, Great. Well, I'm glad you made it back. Well,
Yeah.
one of the things I wanted to ask is kind of a follow up around, the pipeline. Is we're seeing obviously this oversupply of entry level or younger. I shouldn't say younger. That's not right. Um, Less experienced talent who's available for the market, and that's creating a choke point essentially for those folks to get employment and jobs. But we're also seeing at the same time an increase in demand on skills that I would think that the younger generations coming out of college may be really well equipped for. Maybe not this graduating class, although I would argue probably to some degree, right? But as they pivot and try to catch up with the demand around AI and machine learning and large language models, et cetera, wouldn't they be better positioned to address the skills that employers are really looking for right now?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That a lot of people, whenever you hear about the, stories, we don't have enough opportunities for entry level folks. They a lot of this and realize this is a bit cyclical. And sometimes when you see a drop in demand for entry level folks, it's more a reflection of what we see in the market more broadly. And
Mm.
when there's more uncertainty, whether it's from, in some cases, AI, attribute it more to like interest rates and other geopolitical tensions and other things going on in the just swirl of the economy right now. Whenever you see that, employers typically tighten their belts for some of the more entry level roles. They do this during recessions, and they're more likely to focus on hiring the people who are known commodities with more experience. But then at some point, they realize, wait, the world is changing and there are new technologies, and the people who are more likely to be able to leverage these new technologies most effectively are often the people who are learning them for the first time alongside everything else they're trying to learn for the recent college grad. So I think that you could definitely see this reversion to more demand for AI native college grads. Always interesting. We've done this for a few years. You start to see how the same stories start to play out over time. And I would not be surprised if we hear the narrative right now that entry level jobs are dying. And then a few years later, we hear the narrative that there's an abundance of entry level people. We need more graduates. I'm not going to promise it's going to happen. We'll see how things play out.
I wonder because when we talk about there's also the the education, the institutional education stuff kind of component to it that I wonder about, where it's like because again, like I work with LLMs, I work with like the transformers is like a huge part of my job, obviously, when we're doing like text analysis and stuff like that. But none of that was really taught to me in my case, right? It had to be self-taught because education, at least like, most entry level positions are going to be like, hey, do you have a degree in this? And so on and so forth. And so they really fall back to that, education institution, and they might not have caught up to those, especially the emerging technologies yet. I'm kind of like, I'm wondering if that could also play a factor in where, like again, in my experience, it was like I had to learn pretty much all that stuff by myself, which is why I'm like, I have a unique offering in the grander space. But at the same time, it's like that's kind of why they ask for all these AI, like we need people knowledgeable in this. And it's like, I don't, who knows? They're definitely teaching it in graduate level. I know a few people who are, getting their masters in like LLMs in particular, right? Like I want to build one from the ground up or something like that, right? But in the undergrad, I'm like, I don't necessarily know. That's something I just don't have sufficient data on, though. Maybe like if you have any of that to weigh in, but yeah, I just find it to be an interesting point.
Yeah. No, it's super interesting. I think it's a great point to raise because, this, is really where I think AI is going to be potentially most disruptive, not necessarily in terms of, oh, ripping and replacing jobs out of existence, like a lot of people talk about, but it's really changing the nature of the skills that people need and that need to be taught, right? It's changing what skills are embedded within roles and what skills need to be embedded within curricula by extension. And I think some educators are on the cutting edge. They're finding ways to incorporate new skill sets around these new technologies into their curricula. And some are still figuring out what's the best way to do that. I don't know that anybody has a magic bullet answer just yet, but there are a lot of approaches that different the training providers are trying to take. I will say,
Mhm.
I think there's a little bit of a push among some corners of the educational community to build these entirely new AI specific degrees. Maybe that's worthwhile. I'm kind of the mindset that you could probably embed a lot of this within existing CS curricula, largely because you need those other skills if you're going to leverage
Yeah.
AI to build these tools. It's not that you're going to learn everything you need to know about LLMs and you're good. You need to know what skills are most demanded across the workforce, even in entry level roles. Yeah, AI skills are some of the fastest growing, but they're not the largest. The largest
Yeah.
are bread and butter, long standing technical skills that have been around for a very long time. They're just not the sexy skills of the moment.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think taking that holistic approach is definitely the best way to do it. But I think that being said, it's easier said than done when it comes to updating curriculum, whether you're talking about, a traditional degree program or, these certifying bodies and, private, training providers and things like that. Sometimes such a process to overhaul and make these updates to curriculum, and you have to get it approved and do all these different things like that, that it's often lagging and can't keep up with the skill demand that we're seeing for all of these skills. And then by the time somebody, I think that's always the thing, is that by the time you go through a 4-year degree program, the technology has changed so much in those 4 years that it kind of is like, how can you keep up and how can you stay relevant, when it's such a, challenge to do that, because of, you know, just how education and the education system works and how that varies by state and by provider and different things like that.
And one of the things I really wanted to ask you, Will Markow, was earlier this year, CyberSeek put out their annual update, and it listed over 500,000 job vacancies. I think we have seen from the data the open jobs decline since that. Maybe so I want to get your validation on that. If it's lower than 500,000 now, qualitatively, and Sasha and I talk about this a lot. It's like we see a lot of open to work banners on LinkedIn. So even while we understand there is a surplus of talent on the entry level roles and acknowledging that, we still see a lot of mid to senior level people out of work, looking for work. And, sometimes it feels like what you observe doesn't necessarily match up with the numbers you see kind of on the stats and reporting from BLS and other data sources. So I didn't know if you had a take on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a good question right now because I think that there has been a lot of misalignment, let's say, between what you're hearing anecdotally and sometimes what you see in publicly reported data sources. I think in some cases it comes down to how things are being counted. CyberSec, when it cites over 500,000 job openings, it's not just talking about core cybersecurity jobs. It's also talking about the network admins or the software developers or others who have some security component to what they do. It doesn't necessarily include every software developer out there, but includes the people who explicitly have some security related responsibilities embedded within their roles. That's how many job openings. And when I say job openings, I don't mean unfilled positions, which is like a little bit of a wonkish distinction, but it does matter because a lot of those jobs, they might have been filled. Maybe employers decided not to fill them after a while. Who knows what happened? But it looks at how many job openings were there over 12 months that employers were posting for cyber related jobs. Um, and there could be many people who were also looking for work during that time. And so if you're not actually contextualizing the demand versus the supply, then you don't always know. CyberSec does do that. They do. I think they estimated that there was something like we have 70 something percent of the workers, which again sounds like there's a big gap. But when you break that across different roles and different experience levels, you can see very different pictures. And so I really have, am believing right now that we're in a tale of two different labor, where on the one hand you have some workers, cyber as well as cyber, who have really specialized in demand set of skills that perfectly align with what a lot of employers are looking for. If you're in that pool of workers, things are great. You're having a hard time fending off job offers in some cases. But if you're in all of the other corners of the market, it's very different. And I think that we have seen a bit of a realignment over the past few years in terms of what types of skills are needed in cybersecurity.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And that was kind of my assumption too, is that there's just this misalignment of, what people's skills have and what their how many job postings are actually out there versus how many they're truly hiring for. And I hope that the companies can kind of figure that out. Like take down the job postings if you're not don't have any intent in hiring for them. I do see that on LinkedIn a lot too, just like a job that gets reposted over and over and over, and it's
Mhm.
been, they don't want to leave that it's up there for 200 days, so they'll just take it down and say, "Yep, it's back up there. It's 30 days old." So I know that's certainly a challenge on the employer, or I'm sorry, the employee perspective, looking for a job. So, Sasha, I don't know if you have anything to add to that too, because I know you're talking to a lot of folks, kind of are also in the same boat of like looking around for jobs for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I definitely agree with those points. And I think we've talked about, just before that misalignment there of, the expectations versus the actual skills that people are looking for. And we've talked about that plenty of times as far as, in job descriptions, companies and are spelling out that they need specific experience with this tool or this software or this product, and not really emphasizing the actual skill that's there. And often that just these differences in products and softwares and things like that are just a different way that it's formatted, or like how the platform works. And not really focusing on the skills at hand, and making sure that people are focusing on what the actual skill development is and getting experience in that specific skill. Um, I think, having direct experience with a software or product or tool is just like a nice to have, because you're just familiar with it. But most of the time, when you do have expertise in that specific skill, you're able to, learn the new platform pretty easily. But I think, just at the end of the day, Just unfortunate because I feel like the job market is just so crazy, and it just sucks that people, tend to. It takes so much longer to find a new opportunity and things like that. And I think, to your point, Jeff, it's not just the entry level folks; it's those mid and senior level people and people who've been with a company for 10, 15 years. And getting laid off and starting kind of over from scratch. And I think we see that not only in cyber and tech, but across industry sectors. And it's just been a really crazy time, for the job market, just overall. So my heart goes out to all those people, and just hoping that it can get better. And I think that starts with getting clearer on what the expectations are that you're really looking for. And I think also changing the perspective of leaders, especially those in cybersecurity, that it's not always about just putting out a new job and trying to get new talent. You have amazing talent within the workforce at your company, that it might just be providing them with additional training and skills development, or giving them the opportunity to make a lateral move from one team to another, and really trying to just work with what you have and grow them, and not always just trying to get something new, and cherishing and giving opportunities to those who are already in the field.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
expanding them and letting them grow into a position. Maybe they don't have
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
skills, but they have that potential and the aptitude, and they just
The interest.
and
Yeah.
the
Like,
interest.
it's
Yeah,
sometimes it's just as much as that. If you're just interested in a different team, and you can, be self-motivated, to Will Denman's point earlier, that sometimes you have to learn a lot of these skills on your own. And it's not like you go back to, official school, but you're kind of just learning on your own, and you're getting some experience, and you can jump from one team to another. And that's,
yeah, if you got
even,
grit and an interest and
yeah,
willingness to give it a shot, it's a skill in its own and a character trait that people want on their
exactly.
teams.
But I
Yeah, go ahead, Will.
Oh yeah. So part of me also just wonders about some of these particular skills and how some of them are kind of generalized, right? When we talk about like, so for instance, cloud is, it's been around and it's still, being asked for and things like that. But I forget what I was reading, but essentially there is this, and I guess this also goes back into our talks about AI and how we could integrate it in, but there's a lot of those underlying principles that are necessary for a, I guess you could say, a full holistic comprehensive education in AI, like what you'd be doing as a part of a job. But like for instance, cloud, there's going to be a lot of stuff that goes beyond just knowing a platform in particular, right? And so there is this almost generalization, or this, I guess, worldliness that you have to have in some of these skills, right? Because you can learn GCP, or I think it's GCS now, but you could learn GCS, but that might still not have you fully qualified to be in a full-on cloud security position, because there are some more general, more conceptual or theoretical kind of aspects to it that are, they carry on from all platforms, right? Work with the platform itself, but then there's the meta of it. There's what kind of goes beyond that, right? Same thing with like with AI, you have so much, at least with like text data, you have not only the, actual computer science behind it, but then there's like highly advanced math that goes into it as well, right? And so I know a lot of people who are going into AI via mathematics, and stuff like that. That was what they were really into, and how they like that application and how it translates to a computer's understanding of language and things like that. And so I think there is also that when we talk about, Sasha, to your point about expectations, I think that's another kind of aspect of it is, how generalist do you have to be for those particular skills? So yeah, I
Yeah.
find that kind of an interesting point too.
Yeah, it's finding that right balance of, you can't be too general with what you're
Yeah.
asking for when it comes to these skills, but then you don't want to be too specific, that, it's finding that right medium there. So,
You need to know the medium, right? Like what you're painting, how to use a paintbrush,
yeah.
right? And what paint you're using. And I think that's goes to like the GCS or GCP kind of point that Will was making. But you also need to know how to apply that medium to your canvas. And whether
Mhm.
you're painting actual canvas, or whether you're painting wood, or you're painting glass, paint, or whatever the marker, whatever you're using is gonna be different on those application surfaces, right? So I think you think about the broad skills and the generality of understanding an enterprise and cybersecurity at large with the nuance and niche expertise in a certain type of tool or platform or capability. You need both to do your job really well. So I like that. I want to shift a little bit. We've been talking about future skills kind of throughout this conversation already, but I want to really shift into that. And I want to turn back to Will Markow real quick as we kind of talk about, well, what skills are really needed, or what challenges do employers kind of have in articulating their need for new skills. I want to first ask a question about the data itself. Now, a lot of the data that we're looking at for labor market comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's kind of a government source where we get a lot of this stuff. But recently, the head of labor statistics was fired for an accusation that the data was being skewed. Now, whether one way you look at that or another, I think there are some concerns about either the data has been wrong and it's been skewed. Can we trust it moving forward now that we get new people in there? Or the data was fine before. Can we trust the data as we get new people in there? I didn't know if you had a take on that, Will. And I think much larger than that, the real question is like, how do you address like a change like that in data, assuming that there might be a change in data? Maybe there won't be, but how does that change your approach to looking at labor market data and using that information to create a picture?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, right now there's no new data to look at because of the shutdown. But once we get back to the data, it's I think this is a very important question. I have a couple thoughts. So I've never worked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics myself, but I've worked with a number of people who have, using their data for a good number of years. They're very transparent in terms of how they produce their data. They always use the same approach. And now that said, there have been changes to society overall and how we engage with different survey mechanisms or don't engage with them for that matter, that I think has started to shift how the kinds of data you get from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So, concrete example, they used to get far higher survey response rates. Partially that's because of security issues. I think that people have been conditioned not to pick up the phone when somebody calls and says that they want to ask you some questions.
A little choppy for us, Will. So I apologies for cutting you off. But my take was that, broadly speaking, the process to get the data, to extract the data, analyze the data from BLS for years has always been the same. So to think that anything's really going to change or should change, at least how they take data in and analyze data and put it out there, is less of a concern. But the concern that maybe you were articulating was around less participants in the survey that goes out to get data, and less of willingness to complete those surveys for folks who are, for the BLS who's actually trying to collect the information on that. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, that's definitely a bit. And in some cases, there are people who also just aren't responding to the surveys by the time they need to release the first round of data, such as small businesses who can't get their data responses out fast enough because hey, they got a million and one other things to do. And so that's why you see some of these large revisions coming in 2 months. But that all that to say, I would say that you should always try across many different data sources. You can use the BLS data, but there are other data sources out there that you can leverage if you're trying to get a picture of what's happening in the workforce. There's some of them are public, some of them come from other data providers. If you're an organization, you can also look at internal data. And I think that having that triangulation across different data sets will maybe not give you a perfect picture of what's going on, but at least gives you the best chance of having as well defined a picture of what's actually happening as possible.
Awesome. Well, appreciate that, and giving us some guidance on that. Hey, there's other sources out there we can look at, and to kind of corroborate a bit and ensure that what we're looking at is normalized to a degree where you feel some fidelity behind the reporting on it. I think Will Denman or Sasha, do you have any other questions specifically around that? I have another kind of question I want to ask Will Markow, but I don't want to just hog the mic all day.
Oh, you're good.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, keep going.
Keep going. Okay.
Yeah.
I think Will Markow, one other question I kind of have for you as it relates to the future skills. If you can kind of wave a wand and fix things for employers. What's the one mistake employers are making in your perspective when it comes to, you know, seeking out new skill sets for the pipeline? What are they missing that they can do to improve their processes for getting ahead of the curve a little bit for futures-based skill needs?
Oh man, I have to just choose one. That's tough.
You choose a couple.
Top three, maybe?
Thinking they have to hire somebody new as opposed to upskilling people they already have. Now, in some cases, yeah, it makes sense to bring in somebody with new capabilities. One of the things we found is that some of the skills that are high growth, they command salary premiums of much $20,000, $30,000 or more just for one skill set. And usually it doesn't cost $30,000 to train someone up in an emerging skill. And so if you can pinpoint those high growth, high value skills that are really hard to find and costly to find on the market, then if you train up existing workers in those skills, then you can save a significant amount of money, first off, by training rather than hiring somebody with a very specialized set of skills that is expensive to fill. You can also then increase retention because that person now sees that you're investing in them and people are more likely to stick around. So most likely going to have a more dedicated employee, and that's going to support company culture. That's going to increase productivity. They're going to be more motivated. And that has a number of different spillover benefits because when you invest in your people, they become more invested in your company. So I think that is one of the, I don't know if I call it mistakes, but I would say opportunities for employers is to reframe how they think about building these emerging capabilities in their team away from thinking that go out and hire somebody or outsource it.
Yep, that makes total sense, and we're all on board with that idea. It's kind of the heart of what we want to do is understand where people's skills are and what the expectation needs are for different organizations and job roles. So we love that. I'm just keeping an eye on the time here, so I want to make sure we wrap up on time, and also give us an opportunity to save some of this for a future episode when cars don't crash into poles over near Will's house. So I'm going to shift to this week I learned, and maybe I'll start with Will Denman. We'll go
Oh, yeah.
Will, Sasha, me. How about that?
Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, so first of all, just before I get into that, I do really like the whole, we talk about salary premiums versus upskilling and things like that. And I think that works across all different, like, whether it's entry level, mid, senior, because I mean, that's also why we're seeing so many people who go from internship to entry level, right? Just across the board, especially in cybersecurity contexts. So I find that investing in your people is paramount, right? And I mean, that's something that I think Jeff, kind of ends every one of these by saying, right? But yeah, no, so I was pretty much just looking into I found this interesting thing, and I think it was actually spurred on by I don't know if you guys saw, it was like literally today, this morning. I believe it was Deloitte has to pay out the Australian government like a partial sum of money due to the fact that some of their research, or I believe one of their reports, was partially AI generated and there was hallucinations in it. So when we talk about things, and it's just a good example of, when we talk about AI is going to take your jobs, AI is going to do this, AI is going to do that, there's always going to be, I guess, it doesn't supplement for, or I guess replace a human expertise and skill, right? So I don't want to go super into it because it's just, I mean, it's a fun little thing, but it's not really what I was interested in. I was looking at, because we're talking about labor markets, and kind of the compensation angle was something I was looking into. And actually, with a lot of these new emerging skills, particularly with AI, LLM, stuff like that, there was actually this interesting positive correlation between employee retention and non-monetary compensation. So they're actually finding that one of the best ways, we're talking about people wanting to hire for especially these emerging skills. Not only are they looking into obviously the salary and things like that, but what is a greater indicator of if somebody will actually be, on that for the long haul, in that company for the long haul, is actually some of those non-monetary sort of benefits, whether it's paid leave, or I believe I have my notes right here. I'm looking, but it was essentially parental leave, some remote work, stuff like that, right? Because obviously there's all of the return to office mandates across the board. Workplace culture is a big one. I mean, that's kind of very general, but a lot of it is kind of, the interest, I guess, right? If it's an interesting project, that's actually going to take a lot of precedent over something like, even paid leave or salary or something like that, right? Obviously, paid leave and salary are really good, but they're also being seen as more just base expectations, right? And so, in order for people to kind of sweeten the pot and get those better, experts, they have to start to kind of, I guess, buff up their non-monetary compensation, which I just found was kind of interesting.
People will take less money if they feel involved, included, and taken care of in their organizations. And culture is really hard to do well. But I think that's a great point you bring up there.
Yeah.
Will Markow, what'd you learn this week?
What did I learn this week? So, this will probably show how my wife is far smarter than me, but she really likes political philosophy of all things. So she got me reading social contract theory, which seems completely unrelated to this. But like the more I start to read about it and think about it, I realize that, social contract is basically the idea that implicitly in a society, like you're giving up some freedoms in order to government and think that it's for a while, you're going to be okay with that. And if you don't, then you rebel. Um, and, for a long time, we, also had these implicit contracts with uh, who we were handing our data to. And we had these implicit contracts with Facebook, LinkedIn, et cetera. And we also had these implicit contracts with training providers that, hey, we go get a degree and on the outs, we get a job. I feel like a lot of these non-governmental social contracts have started to break down, and they're arguably more pernicious than some of the broader social contracts that people have historically thought about. Because if and it ties back to cybersecurity, because if we don't have trust in our data privacy, then that implicit contract that we're handing our data over to somebody and they don't use our data for pernicious means, then that breaks down. If we feel as though we can't work hard and get educated, get a degree, and then get a good job on the other side of that, then that social contract breaks down. So I think that it's really interesting to view some of these workforce challenges through that lens of the implicit assumptions we made about what it took to get ahead, or if they continue to break down.
Yeah, great. That's really interesting. I'll have to read that book too. So if you don't mind sharing that with us, that'd be great. Sasha, what'd you learn this week?
Yeah. So next week, I'll actually be headed to the Cyber Bay Conference here in Tampa, Florida. And in preparation for that, they actually put out this survey report that I was kind of just reading. And it talked about a lot of the things that we're talking about. The conference, definitely talks a lot about AI. And one thing that I thought was interesting, though, was it really reinforced that the cybersecurity gaps aren't just about those technical gaps. It talked about cultural, educational, and leadership investment, and really highlighting that, sustainable cybersecurity really depends on the people, not just the technology. And I thought it was interesting some of the statistics that it kind of put out. I'm talking about how more than 80% of the organizations that they surveyed said that their tools are too expensive or complex. But at the same time, they admitted that they lack policies and culture that's needed to sustain the security. And I think that, it really just kind of goes into that it's not just about the tools themselves, people, the training, and the leadership alignment is really important. And it also talked about just how I was mentioning earlier, how the education and training are lagging behind, and the need for hands-on learning and soft skill development is really important. And that personally resonates with me, because I'm always talking about how it's not just the technical skills. We need to focus on developing these soft skills as well. So it was just kind of really interesting to have, anytime we can have the data that supports that and talks about these things that we're conversations that we're talking about today, is just always good to have. So it was interesting to read up on that and to see that some of the data that they were able to pull from that survey. And I'm just looking forward to learning even more when I go and attend the conference next week. And I think that talks to Will's point about some of those non-compensation benefits, but just again, employees and making sure that they're getting the opportunity to get professional development and attend conferences and events like this, where we can learn and take in all this knowledge and apply it to not only conversations that we're having, but obviously in the places that we're working.
Love it. Love it. Two. Well, first one's my first this week I learned is that Chat GPT actually sucks to give me ideas for this week. I learned that's a complete fail. So I have to go out and learn something. So yeah, this week I learned that the National Cybersecurity Alliance and CybeSafe recently put out a report And I think this is kind of interesting because we don't share this week I learned with each other before the show. We kind of hear it first here on live. So this is not intentional, but I think there is this big common denominator across the four of us and what we learned this week that relates back to company culture and training. Because the data point that was really interesting from this particular report, and the report's called "Oh Behave: The Annual Cybersecurity Attitudes and Behaviors Report of 2025 to 26," and it has a lot of data in there. So I definitely recommend everyone giving it a read. But as it relates to AI and behavior, it did say that 65% of participants are now reporting that they use AI. I think that seems in line with kind of a lot of the other data that we're seeing in the market and with our customers, et cetera. But the really interesting point was that 43% of workers admitted to sharing sensitive work information with AI tools without their employer's knowledge. So when we talk about culture of and even like awareness and training pieces, like the traditional awareness and training is far gone behind us, and we need to make sure that people are caught up with data sharing rules, regulations, risks, concerns. Well, Denman, you mentioned the Deloitte thing at the very beginning of your This Week I Learned. So um, I think that's a really important piece. I imagine it's even higher than 43%. Um, so I think it highlights the need for, companies, if they're not already on top of this, really rolling out with those policies and awareness and training and education around AI usage, right? You want to encourage it if you're kind of leaning into the future and using that as a tool set, but also making sure that your risk policies are keeping up to date with that usage as well, so that people aren't inadvertently causing more risk in their deliverables or with sharing sensitive data that could be unintentionally, or that shouldn't be shared with the world, whether that's protected information or whether that's IP, et cetera. So I thought those were really interesting pieces. Anybody else want to recap that before we kind of
Yeah.
close out?
Well, I was gonna say, because I'm just, again, don't let those implicit contracts, just get fizzled out, right? And I think there is the aspect of like trust, right? On the side of, people aren't aware, right? That's why like cyber awareness and training really does pay off, because it's like, yeah, you don't want to, because the company is going to be responsible, and by extension, you would be responsible if you posted this and there was a data leak, right? Um, which is interesting. And I don't know if enough people know that, right? But even, like Will Markow, when you're talking about, these kind of contracts and stuff, like, we even saw that with like, the T app. I don't know if you guys saw about that, but there was a huge data breach in that way, I believe, just due to just some insecure code. And, it's one of those things where we will interface with these, chat bots, we'll interface with these apps, trying to, assuming they're going to have that full trust, kind of relationship. And, we're just getting proven time and time again that it's pretty dangerous to do that. Right. And that's why it's now more important than ever to try and retain those, right. Those contracts, using Will Markow's words. But yeah, I just found that was interesting. I think it's an example of synchronicity. Like we're all like kind of in the same space right now. Right. So anyways.
So yeah, that's it for today's episode of this Cyber Talent Matrix Live. Thanks for tuning in. Over the next few episodes, we'll be diving into even more details on emerging cyber competencies and their effect on cyber talent today. And we hope to share some interesting and impactful research results that we've been working on with all of you soon as well. So needless to say, there's a lot of good stuff coming your way over the next few episodes. In the meantime, let's stay connected. Follow me, my co-hosts, and today's guest, Will Markow, on LinkedIn. Follow the SkillRex company page as well as FourOne Insights on LinkedIn for additional news, insights, and updates. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the show, Cyber Talent Matrix, on YouTube so you don't miss any future episodes of the show. So if you're working on anything related to cyber workforce strategy, you've got two really great resources here with FourOne Insights and SkillRex. So don't be shy about reaching out if you need some support. We know we would love to assist you with any of your workforce needs. So with that, thank you for joining us today, Will. We appreciate having you on, and we look forward to having you on in a future episode. And to everyone else, have a wonderful day.